Hi, my name is Matt McCoy, and today we're going to go over the Corps of Discovery Expedition. This expedition is also often referred to as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. When focusing on this period of time, we're really looking at the years 1803 to 1806. This expedition did take a couple of years and ended up crossing much of what's known as the west of the United States of America today. Before we really talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition and their way westward, we really have to talk about the Louisiana Purchase, for it was the real reason that the Lewis and Clark expedition became relevant. The Louisiana Purchase was an agreement between the United States and France. This occurred in 1803, and the reason that we can gain this much land from a country like France is because of their situation, politically and economically. France had numerous revolts in its own land at the time and also looked at possible war with the United Kingdom. This amount of land and the money that they could gain from the United States made sense in a trade agreement. The overall size for the Louisiana Purchase was 828,000 square miles, which equates to 530 million acres. This massive tract of land west of the established areas owned by the United States at the time essentially doubled the size of the country. Because of this uncharted area, there became a need for an expedition west, and this is really where we start the journey of the Lewis and Clark expeditions. In a short period of time, due to the actions of Thomas Jefferson, the country essentially doubled in size. Thomas Jefferson's one of his main motivations was to get to New Orleans to use as a port in the south. But now they had all this land to the west, he also had essentially four primary goals with this new land. He wanted it to be explored to see what the terrain and resources were available in it. He wanted to trade with the natives. There were a lot of Native Americans to the west, to their knowledge, but I don't think the actual scope of the population was truly understood by them. And he wanted to reach the Pacific Ocean. Now, with the Pacific Ocean, Thomas Jefferson was also highly interested in finding a waterway that connected all the way to the Pacific. This would be very important for trade, especially being able to trade to the west, Asian countries, and run boats with goods inside of the country. He appointed Captain Meriwether Lewis himself, who then appointed a helper, William Clark, to lead with him throughout the expedition. These two men knew each other from the military and were both capable leaders for an expedition of this scope. Congress gave them a budget of essentially $2,500, which during the time was a very large amount of money, and they immediately started collecting things that they would need for the expedition. Captain Lewis himself studied astronomy, medicine, and maps that were available in order to do the best he could as a leader. They also obtained a keelboat, which is a very large boat. They could carry much of their equipment. They had experimental weapons such as air rifles that could be used to actually take deer-sized game, and they also brought large amounts of items to trade with the Native Americans specifically. This included special silver coins that were meant to make peace. Lewis and Clark also brought a large amount of books, medicine, and science literature. This expedition, although technically led by military personnel, was also very science-based. The keelboat would be loaded with much of the goods, and two smaller boats would be used later to move personnel. After selecting their men, Lewis and Clark ended up with 34 if you count Lewis's dog, Seaman. The group consisted of Captain Lewis and Clark, 4 sergeants, and 24 privates. On May 14th, the Corps met with Lewis at St. Charles, Missouri, where they would leave a week later on May 21st. The initial going was a little bit arduous. It was hot, insects were common, and the area was generally uncomfortable to travel through. On August 20th, 1804, quite early into the expedition, Sergeant Floyd, one of the 4 sergeants to the section, fell ill and died. It's thought that Sergeant Floyd died of an abdominal infection such as appendicitis, and he would actually be the only death during the expedition. It is thought during the expedition of the Corps of Discovery that they would encounter over 50 tribes. Depending on sources, some say over 70 Native American tribes would be contacted during this expedition. Since the Louisiana Purchase essentially made most of the Native American land the United States, the Corps would actually develop a system to explain how the United States technically owned these Native American tribes' land. They would often have a parade when they arrived at a new location to a new tribe. They would give them some of those silver coins and trade goods, but they would eventually, during the course of interaction with these tribes, tell them that they actually were on land owned by the United States. One of the things that Lewis and Clark noted during the expedition is that the Native American tribes' cultures vastly changed throughout the regions. These Native Americans had very specific regions that they occupied, and the terrain and their history changed their culture quite a bit. Some Native American tribes lived in small teepees, others larger settlements, and their cultures and their views on different things were vastly different from each other. One of the issues that they would notice during the expedition is the vast amount of languages spoken by these tribes. This would become arduous at times and almost result in quite a few fights during the expedition. Save one incident I will speak about later, the relations with the Native Americans were actually quite good. Lewis and Clark were not on a campaign to destroy Native American culture or lives, and generally traded with and were friendly towards these Native Americans. They would themselves be saved by Native Americans on at least 2 occasions. Since this expedition took place in the early 1800s, where technology was limited to essentially what people could find in nature, winter became a significant issue during the expedition. During winter months, when snow fell heavily and it was much more difficult to obtain food, the expedition would often halt. During their travels in North Dakota, the expedition discovered a Native American tribe known as the Mandans that were friendly to them, and they decided to stay in their area on the river that winter. During that winter, in 1 month, Fort Mandan was constructed. As you can see in the background, it has large 16-foot pickets around the outside. This would create a safe hub that could be used for the winter. During this winter, the Corps basically refit on leather. They hunted for their food, and they restocked. They tried to remain healthy, and no one died during this period of time. While they were at Fort Mandan, Lewis and Clark met a trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, who was married, which is kind of a loose term, to Sacagawea. Sacagawea would become a crucial ally during the expedition because of her ability to speak with other Native Americans, and she would eventually join the expedition along with her husband, Toussaint. Sacagawea was actually kidnapped as a child, and Toussaint essentially bought her, but they did have a young baby. So they joined the expedition. After the winter, Lewis and Clark continued to move west. Lewis and Clark's expedition had to evolve as they went on. As they pushed west, they discovered quite quickly that there was no actual river that went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Because of this, they had to change tactics and travel on foot for much of the expedition as well. Before continuously pushing to the west, some of the crew was actually sent back to St. Louis on April 7, 1805. These crew members had zoological and botanical samplings, along with letters and other information from the expedition to take home. As they pushed west, conditions became much more difficult as they entered mountain ranges. Lack of food, water, and common illnesses became quite difficult for them. Sacagawea actually helped the expedition obtain horses on their way west from Native Americans, and as they pushed west, they eventually ran into the Nez Perce tribe. This tribe was extremely friendly and actually took the expedition into their fold to help them refit. After giving them food and trade, the Nez Perce tribe taught the expedition how to create dugout canoes from pine trees, and these canoes would become essential as they pushed west. Using the canoes and leaving the horses behind, the expedition pushed through Montana at Lemhi Pass and continued westward towards the Pacific Ocean. The Corps of Discovery expedition finally came to the halfway point and a critical point in November of 1805. November of 1805, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean. Although not able to do so in one continuous river journey like they once hoped, the monumental task was done nevertheless. After reaching the ocean in November, they did have to winter one more time before heading back, so they constructed Fort Clatsop. Fort Clatsop's construction only took about 2 weeks, but the conditions during that winter were rough. Fleas, other insects that stick near human heat, and constant illness and discomfort were common during this period of time. Again, with the theme of this expedition, a lot of suffering took place at this location, but surprisingly, no one died. On March 23, 1806, the group left Fort Clatsop to head home. Although the winter was rough and it was uncomfortable, all the men made it, and they were ready to go home. At Lolo Pass in Montana on the way back, the group actually split up. Lewis's group was engaged in combat for the first time during this period. 2 Blackfeet warriors that were among a group of over 10 were seen trying to steal horses from Lewis's group, and because the horses were their only transportation and this act was considered robbery, they were killed. This is the only engagement that resulted in human death during the expedition. Shortly thereafter, Lewis was accidentally shot while elk hunting. One of his fellow soldiers that was elk hunting with him mistook him for an elk, probably due to his leather pants that mimicked the same color and movement as an animal, and he actually got shot through the buttock into one of his thighs. Although he would eventually recover and not experience long-term damage from this incident, it took 28 days for Lewis to recover from this. During the early part of his healing process, he pushed himself a little too hard and reopened the wounds, and subsequently had to lay on his stomach to recover for nearly a month. Following Lewis's injury, the crews eventually reunited on August 12th. As they headed on their final stretch east home, Sacagawea and her family was dropped off. The group would return home finally on September 23rd, 1806, to a hero's welcome. The entire expedition, both west and their subsequent return, would consist of over 8,000 miles of travel. Both Lewis and Clark would receive 1,600 acres of land and double pay for their positions of leadership during this expedition, and they would also both be given positions of leadership. Lewis would become the governor of Louisiana, whereas Clark was appointed as the brigadier general of Louisiana Territory. Following the expeditions, Clark was well respected and led a normal and successful life. Lewis, on the other hand, would never marry, become a heavy drinker, and die in 1809 to 2 gunshot wounds, potentially self-inflicted. 2 years after his death, Sacagawea would also die, and Clark would actually become the guardian of her child. Why is this important? What legacy could be left by 2 men in an expedition of less than 30? Quite a lot. Lewis and Clark's historical contribution to the United States is massive. During their expedition, Lewis and Clark and their team drew over 140 maps of the regions they discovered. They made contact with over 70 Native American tribes. They did not engage in open conflict with them. They learned from them, traded with them, and learned their culture, which is very important during this time. Because of Lewis's education prior to the expedition, and because it was part of their mission, they also described over 200 new plant species. Although the expedition did not find a continuous waterway west because there is not one, they did reach the Pacific Ocean. Cities were named after the explorers. Lewis and Clark County in Montana, for example, Lewis and Clark National Park in Montana as well. The state flower of Montana and Idaho were named after Lewis. These men completed a journey that changed their world and our world now in one try. These are the sources that I use to compile the information on my project. I highly recommend anyone that's interested in Lewis and Clark to do a little research on their own. The History Channel and PBS both have a large amount of sources that are extremely easy to read, chronological, and they're very interesting. Hope I was able to teach you something about the Corps of Discovery's expedition, who Lewis and Clark were, and why it's important to us today. Thank you.